Aunt Mabel sat in her sewing room. It was a small room, but its 3 windows made it very well lighted. An ancient sewing machine sat on a table facing the 3rd window. Aunt Mabel was 70 years old and had lived in her house for 50 of those years. She spent most of those 50 years right here in this room, surrounded by fabric scraps. She had been a beautiful young woman once, and sometimes she believed she still was. She was old now, feeble, wrinkled, slow, and hunched over. Some even believed she was senile, but she didn't. Sure, she was a little confused sometimes. Perfect sense to her. Aunt Mabel had always loved to sew. When she was young, and she and Uncle Henry had just been married, Aunt Mabel kept busy by sewing. She sewed for everyone. After Harold, her son, began to wear clothes, Aunt Mabel was always making him cute little outfits. As Harold grew up, Aunt Mabel made all of his clothes for her men and drapes and quilts that she hardly ever had time to make herself a new dress for church. When Harold got married, Aunt Mabel stopped making his clothes. She figured that that's what his wife's job was. Not too soon after Harold's wedding, Uncle Henry died. After that, Aunt Mabel stopped sewing clothes altogether. Now, Aunt Mabel mostly makes quilts. She made her great-grandson Andy's first baby quilt. It was a patchwork quilt and had been quite artistic considering Aunt Mabel would keep him all day when Harold and his wife could not find a sitter. As a matter of fact, Andy was visiting today. Andy was only 2 years old and quite a handful. Sometimes Aunt Mabel could not handle him. He was just so rambunctious that he always wanted to talk. He never wanted to listen. Aunt Mabel sat in her well-lighted sewing machine, surrounded by scraps of fabric, and smiled wickedly at herself. She had found the perfect solution to that problem. Aunt Mabel always believed that children should be seen and not heard. Now she could be sure that Andy would be a good little boy and not speak unless he was spoken to. Aunt Mabel felt so triumphant, she decided it was about time she made herself a fine new dress for church. She decided it would be her greatest project to date. It would be dazzling, made of silk and velvet. It would be the talk of the town. As Aunt Mabel reached for the new fabric scraps, she heard a murmur in the other room. For a few brief seconds, Aunt Mabel forgot what she was doing. Oh yes, she was going to make a dress. What color should it be? She then produced her needle and thread. The first stitch was the hardest. Aunt Mabel almost screamed out of pain, but the rest of the stitches were almost exhilarating. It's so nice to be sewing for people again, Aunt Mabel thought with a wide smile. Her flesh sprang up in goosebumps. She was so excited. Aunt Mabel had been right. Her new dress was the talk of the town. As a matter of fact, she'll probably remain the talk of the town for quite a few years. The police were called to the small white house on the corner when neighbors complained of a child screaming uncontrollably. Needless to say, the officers were shocked when Aunt Mabel answered the door covered in her own blood with little triangles of fabric stuck to her arms and chest. She answered the door just as pleasant as if nothing was wrong. Everything was fine. No problems. When the officers had a chance to look around the small 2-bedroom house, they made a gruesome discovery. They found little 2-year-old Andy in what used to be Harold's room. He was terrified and crying. The story made headlines the next day. Even in the grainy black and white of the newspaper, you could see where the little boy's lips had been sewn together. Now believe me, Aunt Mabel was not a mean woman. She would not hurt a fly. Actually, she did not see where she had done anything wrong. Aunt Mabel stuck to her story. Children should be seen and not heard. The doctor in the emergency room had to sedate Aunt Mabel to get the pieces of fabric unstitched from her own skin. She kept screaming, "You're ruining my new dress!" and was thrashing her arms and legs to try to stop the doctor. Andy still has nightmares, but he's doing well considering what he'd been through. He has not spoken a word since that day, and most believe he will never talk again. Years from now, after the story has been exaggerated so much that most people believe it to be a legend, most mothers will tell the story of Aunt Mabel to their children. They will say that if they do not be quiet, Aunt Mabel will come in the middle of the night and sew their mouths shut. Your schemes are split up the seams. I don't need to argue anymore. You're left exposed wearing yesterday's clothes. Now you've undone the stitches we sewed. The pocket of schemes are split up the seams. I don't need to argue. I split up the seams. You're left exposed wearing yesterday's clothes. Now you've undone the stitches we sewed. This is an awful story.